Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're diving into a topic that might surprise many of our listeners, the intersection of modern law with practices like exorcism and accusations of witchcraft.
While many might think these issues are relics of the past, they continue to present challenges for legal systems around the world, including in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom.
To help us understand this complex subject, we're joined by two distinguished guests, Professor Helen Hall from Nottingham Trent University and Professor Javier Garcia Oliva from the University of Manchester.
These legal experts will be sharing their insights on how modern societies balance religious freedom with the need to protect vulnerable individuals.
We'll be exploring questions like, how do legal systems define and address exorcism? What are the complexities surrounding consent in these practices? And how do accusations of witchcraft still impact people today?
It's a fascinating discussion that challenges our assumptions and sheds light on an often overlooked area of law and society.
So, whether you're a legal professional, a student of religious studies, or simply curious about how our diverse world navigates these issues, you're in for an enlightening episode.
Let's get started with our conversation with Professors Helen Hall and Javier Garcia Oliva.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. Please introduce yourselves and give us some background information about your work.
I'm the Reverend Dr. Helen Hall. I'm currently an associate professor at Nottingham Trent University. I specialise in work around law and religion and belief, and also history and anthropology of the law. And I'm an Anglican priest as well, which has some relevance to this kind of work and this kind of world.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Josh, for having us here. It's a real privilege to be with yourselves and your listeners today. I am Javier Garcia Oliva. I'm a professor of law at the University of Manchester. I happen to be the current head of law at this institution. I am a researcher in the field of law and religion, like Helen. Helen and I have worked closely with each other throughout the last few years, quite a few now. I'm a public lawyer, therefore I'm a constitutional lawyer. I have a strong interest in issues such as sovereignty, independence of states, but this is a topic maybe for another day. But my second stream, which is probably the reason why we are here, is we have an interest in law, religion, the supernatural, exorcism, witchcraft, and all these areas. Then I write on my own, like Helen does, but on many occasions we write jointly, and we're absolutely delighted to be with yourselves today.
Thank you so much. How did you come to begin working with each other, and what are you working on now?
Okay, no,
I sat next to you at a Christmas lunch, didn't I?
Yeah. We're still part of a center for law and religion at Cardiff University, which is led by a rather distinguished and absolutely brilliant guy called Norman Doe. He's an expert in Anglican canon law. And then I happened to come to the UK, to Cardiff, to do my PhD with him. And then I have maintained this collaboration with him throughout the years. Then we had this annual gathering every Christmas. And then my wonderful co-author happened to be at that stage the PhD supervisee of Norman Doe. And then we met there, and we've worked very closely with each other throughout the years, mainly in the field of law and religion, but not exclusively, because last year, for instance, we were delighted to see the publication of a joint book with Toronto University Press on the whole notion of sovereignty and independence, as I mentioned, in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Spain, with the case studies, if you like, were Quebec, Catalonia, and Scotland. But mainly our interaction is in the field of law and religion. And I very much love working with Helen because she's very bright, but also because she's a private lawyer. Then in this divide, I'm a public lawyer, private lawyer. then we bring our disciplines together. The reality is that law is law. We keep saying we can't just confine law to a square. Therefore, that's the reason why we've been approaching different areas together in the last few years. And Helen, otherwise I'm going to be talking throughout the whole
Yes.
interview. Would you like to say what
I,
we are working at right now?
well, yes. I mean, I think one relevant thing is that we've got a long-standing interest in minorities within groups and intersectionality, and trying to balance different clashing freedoms and considerations. And that's really what led us into some of our work on exorcism and also some of our work on witchcraft. At the moment, we're looking at a book with really the law and the supernatural, topics which are either outside of things that people perceived as being religious or parallel to them. And we're looking at that basically from the early modern period right through into the 21st century and the contemporary context. And we have a chapter on exorcism, a chapter on witchcraft, a chapter on service magic, a chapter on mediums and contacting the dead and the law, and really how all of these issues present this sort of balancing act between, on the one hand, respecting individual choice and the diversity of our society, and on the other hand, trying to protect vulnerable people from exploitation or abuse, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's a common thread in our research. We've been particularly obviously concerned about upholding religious freedom because it's definitely a non-negotiable principle of a democratic state. Therefore, we don't believe religious freedom is exclusively an individual right. It's also a collective right because religious communities and people live religion or beliefs in communities, but at the same time, religious freedom cannot be used as an excuse in order to infringe the rights of vulnerable people. Therefore, if any community, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it doesn't really matter, but those individuals who are vulnerable within those communities are not only faithful of those denominations, they are also citizens of the United Kingdom or Spain or the USA, and they also need to receive the protection of the state. Then it's striking the right balance between obviously the protection of collective religion, but also making sure that those individuals who are in more vulnerable position, and we talk about obviously children, sometimes adults with some difficulties, or then we really need to make sure that those people are sufficiently protected. And I think, yeah, the first article we published on that was in Public Law, which is a journal which is probably one of the top journals in constitutional law in Europe or and in the UK, obviously. And we've been really fascinated by this theme ever since.
When you speak about the vulnerability in the legal system and the freedom of religion, I'm trying to see if it just tracks that you've got a vulnerable person within their religious community when they need help.
I think, yes, it is quite complicated in that a lot of the people who find themselves, on the one hand, at risk of things that they don't properly consent to in terms of spiritual and religious practices or accusations of witchcraft or demonic possession, often are people who are not in as good a position to access legal protection. It often disproportionately affects children and young people. Certainly, there's still a huge gender thing, women. And often this is minority communities in terms of language and culture. And often women can be less likely to have opportunities to become fluent in the language of the main jurisdiction, which means if you can't talk to people, it's hard to access help. It's also hard sometimes to understand what the norms are in this new society. And you might not even be aware that the treatment you're receiving is actually not the treatment that you're entitled to. At the same time, it's complicated because obviously you've got to be cautious about ascribing vulnerability to people and saying, oh, you're not living your life in the way that white middle class people are, therefore that is in and of itself problematic. Getting a genuine, nuanced idea of what's going on can be really difficult, especially when communities feel vulnerable, feel perhaps persecuted, and that they're not getting the same rights and respect as other people. But equally, all human communities are capable of internally having unhelpful power dynamics as well. What did you want to
Yeah,
add to that, Javi?
I think that's brilliant. I would say Helen has highlighted Sarah and Josh some of the most important aspects of the whole discussion. Because when we say vulnerable people within religious communities, I think the legal framework can be sufficiently robust. But as Helen was saying, individuals involved may not be fully aware of the mechanisms of protection that the legal framework can provide. And this is an issue. Therefore, I think this is the balance I was highlighting earlier on, trying to strike the right balance, because we need to protect collective religious freedom. Religious denominations should have autonomy, should have the possibility to administer and regulate their own business without any interference from the state. But it shouldn't be carte blanche. It shouldn't be just because I'm a religious community, I can do whatever I like with my members. No, there must be mechanisms in order to address those shortcomings. And in the worst case scenario, if we're talking about crimes or other practices, the law of the land must really bite and must be intervening in those situations. Then it's not so much a matter of the law, which is there, even though as academic lawyers, Helen and I will be advocating for betterments or improvement of the law. It's also a matter of societal expectations at times. I think that's happened also in the United Kingdom, and we have been encountering those situations. I think commendably, in the UK, British authorities have tried to obviously combat any sort of accusation of being racist or xenophobic or Islamophobic, etc., which I think is commendable, because it's important to obviously claim that all individuals are equal irrespective of their faith, ethnicity, and so on. But also at times there have been a few scandals, and Helen can really probably tell us much more about it here in the UK, in which public authorities have decided to refrain or abstain from intervening in the business of either a religious community or a minority ethnic group, because there was this fear of being seen as anti-Muslim or anti-Asian and so on. And those people at the other end of the whole framework obviously were in a very vulnerable situation, and they haven't received the protection of the state. Then a crime is a crime. And obviously I am at pains to stress that we need to condemn in the clearest possible way any anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and so on. But obviously, Jewish, Muslim, Christian kids that are going to be mistreated by members of their community, those children need the protection of the state. And this is sometimes there have been a fear on the part of secular authorities to intervene because they were afraid of being seen particularly Islamophobic, for instance, in the current paradigm. Would you agree with my analysis, Helen?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a very tragic case at the beginning of the 21st century, the Victoria Columbia case, about a little girl of African heritage who was brought here in an informal foster arrangement and was subject to the most horrendous abuse and was eventually murdered. And there were multi-agency failings, but one of the factors which prevented authorities stepping in was a genuine desire to be culturally sensitive. And they misinterpreted and actually normalized things that were not at all normal within the particular African community that the child came from. But they felt that things which might have been red flags were perhaps somehow acceptable. even though as far as the law goes, there is no double standard. There is a sort of red line about abusive treatment, and anything the wrong side of that line needs attention. I think the other complicated factor, as well as the sort of community level, is that very often, although not universally, spiritual abuse, whether that's in the form of exorcism or witchcraft accusations, is a form of domestic abuse. It's very often family members, or at the very least, trusted close members of the community, who are the ones making the accusations. And that can be another factor that can cause it to be very difficult to access help, because just in the case of other forms of domestic abuse, whether that's intimate partner violence, whether that is coercive control, whether that is forced marriage, people are reluctant to come forward because they love and they have a relationship with the people who are doing the damage, and they don't want to see their mum, their dad, their partner get in trouble with the law. So it's a really, really delicate and difficult, as Javier was saying, to actually get the balance right in terms of implementing the law. It's not just a case of having the right stuff on the statute book.
And then there's also, I think Helen also hinted at that at the very beginning of one of her previous contributions, is the whole notion of consent, because I think there are quite a few scholars who put a lot of emphasis on consent, but consent is not always operative. And I think that's quite an important feature, at least here in English law. You cannot really consent, strictly speaking, to actual bodily harm. And there are some exemptions. Obviously, you can consent to that if it's in the context of a sport activity like boxing, or is a medical intervention and so on. But practices such as exorcism, we would argue that they are not covered. And there is a very famous case, Brown, that refers to that. Is one of the landmark cases in criminal law in England. Then I think it's quite important to emphasize that many people who don't have a legal background, and not everybody has to have it. I think most people shouldn't, because life is much more than law, but law is very exciting. Would say, well, but he gave his consent. Well, you cannot give your consent. I can ask you, the fact that I tell you, sir, I would like to be beaten up by you, and then you end up killing me, that shouldn't be an exemption. You have still committed a criminal offense, and my consent won't be operative. Then some scholars would argue, well, those people who have given their consent, for instance, in an exorcism, they consented to that. And it's interesting because we identified American cases where consent was given a lot of weight. But at least in the British context, it's not really important. You can really consent to practices that are going to give rise to terrible harm, and certainly not death.
A lot of people have their concept of an exorcism from the movies. What is an exorcism today? What can it be? I know it's different across different contexts, but basically, what is an exorcism today?
I think that's a really good question. And Javier and I, in our writing, have deliberately adopted a very broad definition. And basically, any rite or practice which is intended to free a person, a place, or an object from an external negative spiritual influence. And I think there are two things to notice about that. One, not everything which is classified as an exorcism is even posing potential harm. There are lots of really benign practices, a Christian reciting the Lord's Prayer, even deliver us from evil, an Anglican or a Roman Catholic, or I suppose in a US context, Episcopalian baptism service. We have a little residual of a medieval exorcism, but nobody notices and the baby's baptized and everyone's happy. Yet, and I think in terms of exorcism, people sometimes ask, why don't you just ban it? Or at least, why don't you ban exorcisms for children or exorcisms for people who are suffering from mental illness? And the answer is, not everything that comes within that basket is in any way even potentially problematic. Also, you don't want to take agency away from people unnecessarily. But also that it's when things do go wrong, they can go wrong in very different ways. And this looks very different in different communities. And there can't be a one size fits all approach when you're dealing with such a complicated context.
No, that's brilliant, Helen. And I would add, Tosh, you're absolutely right. I think one of the problems we have when we cover this topic and we deal with it from a more academic viewpoint, as Helen and I have done in the course of the last few years, is that you need to overcome the stereotypical image of exorcism on the part of many people. I think films haven't helped us. I'm not going to comment on The Exorcist as a film. It brings me back to my childhood for some reason. It must be from the 80s, I suspect. I may be wrong or probably older than that, but it was one of those films that, struck me when I was a teenager and so on. And it's the whole idea of exorcism is like horrible, horrible. It's something absolutely terrible. I wouldn't want to disappoint some of our listeners here, but I would say that we should be perhaps quite adventurous and recognize that exorcism is not just part of fringe religious minorities, it's part and parcel of the tenets of mainstream religious denominations. And exorcism is part of Roman Catholicism, is recognized by the Anglican faith. If I'm not mistaken, it's also part of Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, then you name it. And Helen has referred to some very striking cases that if we just had a ban, because some of my more secular friends, and I think that's quite normal nowadays in British academia, and that's fine, absolutely fine, because this is what democracy is about. Is the beauties of all of us are different. But some people, I understand if they don't have a religious faith, they find, oh, the whole notion of exorcism is something dark, obscure, sinister. We just need to prohibit it. No, it's not that simple. First of all, because it's part and parcel of many faiths. Secondly, because exorcism is not necessarily a practice which is going to be damaging or harmful. Helen has identified some practices which are clearly not, but also, obviously, the law will have to bite once again when there is a danger or when there is a harm for the individual affected. And we have been very, very clear, Helen and I, in our writing that, and also we've been involved in the whole conversion practices, therapies, and so on. Consent is not operative in many of these contexts, and it shouldn't be. Anyway, no, but yeah, the sort of exorcism I encountered when I was a teenager and my image of exorcism is very different from what I regard as exorcism as a law academic in 2024. Josh.
This is a good example of people looking from the outside in and making unhelpful assumptions, because the Pazuzu image, the famous demon who gets the blame for the whole mess in The Exorcist, actually was probably a figure that was protective in the culture that he came from and wasn't at all sinister or a bad thing. So you do need to be very careful before you go rocking into someone else's cultural context and making assumptions about what may or may not be harmful.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing up that point. I think that plays into the fear that those who are not informed about cultures and practices, that definitely is apparent.
Absolutely, Sarah. But what I would say there is we need to be mindful of diversity, and we must be extremely respectful for minority choices. Then, as I always tell my students, we have a duty to be law abiding, but we don't have a duty to be mainstream or to fit into the majority pattern. People are allowed to be different. Helen and I have written about, I don't know if you're familiar with, in the United Kingdom, in Scotland, we have beautiful islands that are known, the Outer Hebrides. They're absolutely fantastic, breathtaking, but they are culturally and religiously very different. They are very, very traditional, very conservative, and they follow traditions very closely that the vast majority of the population would regard nowadays as outdated or old-fashioned. And as I always say, I think they have a point in trying to protect their own traditions, and I don't think we have a duty to be liberal or to be mainstream, people can hold. But this is different from allowing, obviously, groups, either majority or minority groups, to perpetuate some practices, because we have to be respectful for, obviously, traditions, customs, but at the same time, we need to uphold the law of the land. And then there are some of these practices that are brought from other jurisdictions, which clearly clash with the law of the United Kingdom or the USA or any other country you want to consider. And I don't think being mindful of diversity means that we need to protect practices which are against our legal systems, and we need to very much combat robustly those practices.
And so we've talked about exorcism and how it's sometimes difficult to address because of this issue of consent. Does the same hold for accusations of witchcraft? In my understanding, one wouldn't necessarily consent to that.
The same thing does, really. Obviously, you get into as well complicated discussions about what these words mean, especially when we're dealing with minority cultural groups. And although in a Christian tradition, I mean, even in the Christian tradition, there is an overlap between beliefs about demonic possession and beliefs about witchcraft accusations. But often we're using these labels and these English words loosely, and we're putting them onto different cultural contexts. One, you get a problem sometimes that individuals will, not in the sense of somebody making a positive religious choice, like a Wiccan might identify as a witch, but you might get somebody who comes from a cultural group that believes witchcraft, or being a witch, is something that you can be born into, or it's something that you can happen to you, and that's a really negative thing. But they might believe it. Yes, if this elder is telling me that I'm a witch, then that is true. And therefore, I'm going to voluntarily participate in whatever kind of intervention is necessary to contain me or to contain the threat that I pose. And also, you can sometimes have situations where someone will say, I'm disputing that I'm a witch, being used in a negative sense, but I'll therefore go along with this test, this practice, to demonstrate that I am not this thing. So you can have really complicated issues about consent and how much choice you actually have in that situation if you want to still be part of your community.
Because I think that's the whole point. Obviously, there is an ongoing conflict there, because you want to be accepted, you want to be loved, you want to be part of your community. And therefore, at times, this is presented as, if we go through this procedure, exorcism, witchcraft, you're going to obviously make sure that you are well and you will be back to the community. And this creates, obviously, that ongoing tension, which is so dangerous. At the same time, it's very interesting, because in this national working group on spiritual and ritual abuse that Helen and I have joined, and we were asked to participate, I think it's led by a gentleman who was a policeman, and he had to deal with lots of cases of witchcraft in British soil. And that's why he was so passionate about making sure that there is a proper response to this phenomenon. But I've always found it bewildering that whenever we present, and I'm a public lawyer, then sometimes I tend to speak about independence and those issues probably in the public law context, mainstream constitutional law. But sometimes I have decided to touch upon these areas because I think, obviously, in terms of public policy and so on, they're equally attractive. And the number of people, these are very cultured people who are obviously teaching in universities and so on, but understandably, and I don't fault them, but they look so surprised. They say, Javi, are you talking about, are these cases happening? You mean here in the UK? And it's quite interesting. Like, for many people, exorcism, all these witchcrafts, they are practices that are really outside our territory. It's not for people like us. Well, it is, because our societies are diverse, and our societies are, obviously, luckily, fortunately, a mixture of identities and cultures. Therefore, this is not an area that we can overlook. We need to look into that because it's happening here in our countries.
And we get that response here when we tell people that accusations of witchcraft and spirit possession happen in the United States. And in fact, if you follow the news, you'll see these exorcism cases, especially, come up fairly frequently across the nation. And that's just the response that we get is it can't be happening. And then when it does happen, people tend to believe that, oh, that's quite a wild thought. It can't be a reasoned belief that somebody's holding that causes them to do this. They must not be in the best frame of mind.
Yeah, but I think, again, that's oversimplistic because it's an understandable response, but at the same time, I think we need to advocate for religious freedom. And, for instance, coming back to exorcism, which is an area which I have studied more thoroughly than witchcraft, we have started, obviously, our research in the latter area. But I think it's simply not true that people are uneducated, and there are people who are really, really well informed, and they take part in non-violent exorcism rites. And then this is our point. It's like it doesn't really matter if X, Y, or Z consider that's appropriate. I mean, as long as we are not breaching the law, it has to be protected, because as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any duty to be all similar or identical one to another. We have a duty to uphold the law of the land. And that is the restriction that I think is absolutely vital. No justification, no cultural, ethnic, or diversity can justify to breach the law of the land, because we are all subject to our legal systems. But at the same time, we need to be nuanced, sophisticated, and recognize that there is a lot of diversity within our borders. And as Helen and I get saying in our own research, when we talk about the nature of constitutions and so on, and we say, what is a constitution at the end of the day? It's like the rules of a game, like the Monopoly. It brings us together. We all have to play. Maybe the four of us, I think if we lived in the same city, I'm sure we would get on with each other very well, and we would become good friends. I have no reasons to think otherwise. On the contrary, you're very likable. But I think on many, many occasions, what happens in societies is like, well, or like in a neighborhood community, you have to live with people who are not necessarily like you, who are different. You may not love them, but you just have to respect each other and be part of the same community. And that is what happens with the legal framework and with practices such as exorcism. We may think that these other people are unusual, different, whatever term you want, but we have to respect it. So I get very excited because it's a topic which I love very much. And I think it brings together all the importance about what is democracy, what is a constitution, how we can all live together, coexist with each other. We are part of, Helen and I have devised games on these areas also, board games. We don't want to be just traditional in that sense. We want to be innovative and create devices to make sure we engage with secondary school children and so on, talking about constitutions, about the rules of the game, what brings us together as a society. And I think this is really, practices like this test us. Somehow it's a test how we, contemporary societies in the 21st century, can deal with these matters, which are the result of diversity, plurality, etc. How we can uphold the legal system, our common legal order, whilst respecting the diversity of our countries.
Mary Louise Bingham is back with A Minute with Mary.
Justice has been stalled for Aurelie Naomi Proctor. You may remember that I spoke of her ongoing case in the recent past. Aurelie's mother, Claudia Hernandez Santos, along with Claudia's brother and father, are awaiting trial at Santa Clara County, California. These three allegedly believe that the then 3-year-old Areli was possessed by a demon and performed an exorcism on this beautiful girl, which resulted in her death in 2021. A court appearance on August 14, 2024, was originally to have set the date for the trial. Instead, the judge decided to issue an order of court to take place on September 23, 2024, meaning that the court is asking someone involved in this case to abide by or abandon a specific action of which we don't yet know. End Witch Hunts has just obtained the transcript of the preliminary hearing, which took place last April. We now know exactly what happened to this sweet, innocent girl, and we will publish a story by the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Now here's this week's edition of End Witch Hunts News.
We are officers of End Witch Hunts, a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness of modern witchcraft accusation-related violence and advocating for solutions.
We've been invited to present at the International Conference on Witchcraft and Human Rights in Lancaster, England, and the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York, England in September 2024, and we need your help to get there.
Literal witch hunts still occur throughout the world today, and the International Conference on Witchcraft and Human Rights on September 19th and 20th is bringing together global leaders, academic experts, and grassroots advocates to address this ongoing global crisis of harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks.
We'll also have the opportunity to speak on ending witch hunts at the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York on September 12th. This event focuses on healing magic, and our talk will center on healing the world through action against witch hunts.
Witchcraft accusations are still a global crisis, often accompanied by violence. Historian Wolfgang Behringer points out that more people are dying in witch hunts today than ever before in history. Since 1961, more than 30,000 people have died in witch hunts in Tanzania alone.
Between 2009 and 2019, 20,000 incidents of witchcraft accusation-related violence were reported in over 60 nations worldwide. Many cases are unreported, and advocates fear the rate of these events is increasing due to various global crises.
Attending these conferences presents End Witch Hunts with opportunities to speak on harmful practices occurring in the United States and around the world, as well as to learn what is being done to address this crisis globally.
The theme of the International Conference on Witchcraft and Human Rights is implementing UN Resolution 47/8, which focuses on eliminating harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. This resolution is a landmark, but advocates must find the right path to solutions.
We need your help to get to this conference. Please consider making a donation to End Witch Hunts so we can share our work, including the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project, the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project, and the End Spiritual and Ritual Abuse Project.
In addition to speaking, we'll learn more about how advocates worldwide are striving to end harmful practices that result in torture, ostracism, psychological trauma, and even death. The knowledge and relationships we gain will aid us in our mission and provide content for our podcast, Witch Hunt.
Your donation will go directly to our trip costs.
To support us, please donate to our GoFundMe page, which is linked in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Witch Hunt.
Join us every week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.